Today, I sit down with Michelle Evans. We're going to talk a little bit about everything that's taking place in Texas. We touch on red flag laws. We're talking about the border. We're talking about pornography in schools. So many issues going on that people are not aware of. So if you want to stay informed and not miss an episode, hit the like button, subscribe, and ring that bell. You're a mom.
Right.
And you have children.
Yeah,
but how
3.
was it growing up in Houston?
I've been struggling this year because this is the first summer that I'm going to be away from the home and the kids are going to be home alone for extended periods of time. And I'm thinking, what are they going to do? Because I didn't have the phone and
Right.
we got to watch TV, but most of the time I would walk to my friend's house or walk to the community pool, and they don't, that's not an option these days. I don't feel comfortable with it. Their friends aren't close enough that I would just say, hey, walk down the street. So things are a lot different. The environment's a lot different, and just the atmosphere for these kids is...
And Texas is changing.
Yes.
There's a saying that California is the direction the America is going to go in. California is a new America. Mm-hmm. And that scares the snot out of me. I think it scares a lot of people. But you've said something that before in the past, I've heard you say this, and you said that there's a one-liner, especially when we're talking about the direction of Texas, that this could never happen in Texas.
Right.
And there's a lot of things that I think people are saying now, we never thought in a million years this was going to happen in Texas. Mm-hmm. And you're talking about the vaccine mandates.
Right. Mask mandates, the environment in schools right now, the curriculum that's being taught, the homelessness problem. There's just a litany of issues that we kind of thought would stay west of us or east of us. And we were kind of resting on our conservative laurels, thinking it would never happen here. And every single time we've said it, it's happened right under our noses.
And that's what's interesting is it almost seems like when the news comes on, we're finding out something new is just happening. And I know that there was an event that took place, especially I can say they're coming after our children. Mm-hmm. I've said that for a long time. I do believe that our children are a target. But something recently took place that made national news. And that was an event that happened in Dallas. And it was drag queens. Was it drag queens? I mean, I think the stories are kind of going back and forth, but there was a picture that went viral and it showed a child sticking dollar bills into this female's, I guess, underwear.
Male.
It was a male. A male's underwear. So it was drag queens.
So you have these men who are, when I was growing up, I was aware of drag shows, right. Down in Montrose, part of Houston, but they were campy and fun. This is something completely different. These are men dressed in a hypersexualized version of what I guess they assume women would dress like and act. Right. And it's no different than being in a strip club environment. They were on their backs, spread eagle. One little girl gave some dollar bills to one of the drag queens and she got down on the splits. And, these are provocative outfits, provocative dancing. And while there is something to be said for being able to raise your child with the morals that you want to guide them with, I think we already have some protections in place and for particular reasons. Like you can't just take a kid into a strip club.
Right. And that's just crossed my mind as a parent is that if I were to take a child to a strip club, I would probably get arrested.
Yes.
We have politicians here in the state of Texas, which we are a very conservative Second Amendment state. And I was raised with guns.
Yep.
My whole life I was raised with guns. I was raised how to respect a gun. I'm not sure if that's even taught anymore. How to respect a gun, when to use a gun, how to use gun. It was to feed, to go hunting, to catch your food so we could get it in the freezer for the year, or to make sure that you are able to protect yourself in your home. But right now, with what's happening with any time a school shooting takes place and we see the politicians start talking about gun control. In Texas, I don't hear this, I could be wrong. In Texas, I don't hear the word gun control as much as I hear red flag laws. And I always find that in politics that they like to use the verbiage.
Right.
they use the verbiage where it sounds appealing because they want to nudge you in that type of direction. But red flag laws, a lot of people are not aware of what red flag laws are. I looked it up. And of course, they talk about how they want to protect the people, but it's taking guns away from law-abiding citizens. And I've heard that when they do that and they take the guns away from citizens, they could keep that person locked up in court for a long time, which means they're never going to have their hands on any of their guns while an investigation is going on, or if they're going to court, they're going to, bankrupt them.
Right.
I'm hearing that's what's happening in the state of Texas, that they're actually contemplating debating red flag laws here.
Yes. And so, and it kind of depends on how it's written, right? But the idea is that someone close to a person who owns guns sort of decides to become thought police. Maybe they said something off the cuff about being angry with someone. Right. Oh man, I could just kill that person. And then suddenly you're tying him up in court, and a judge is making the sole decision to remove your constitutional right from you.
It's interesting. You just reminded me of something. When I lived in California, I took my daughter to a pediatrician because she had a sinus infection. And one of the questions on the paperwork they asked was, is there a gun in your home? And then now in the educational system, they're starting to ask questions, is there a gun in your home?
Right.
So it's almost like they want to know which way, which means, do you have any guns in your home? Is it safe? Do you feel threatened?
Right.
But what's interesting is I see a lot of talk about red flag laws. I have to say this because I'm a football freak. Yeah, there are some great schools out there. I know my daughter's school are doing training. They're doing a training this week. They're doing an exercise in case of a shooter comes into the school, how they're going to respond. But I'm not hearing politicians talk about all the money that they're going to put into protecting our schools. People don't understand. I understand. I feel safe when I drive by in my daughter's school, in our school district, that there is a huge Yukon that has the police in front of every single school, which I know that's the first thing people are going to see is the police car. But I don't hear them talking about the money going in and what they're going to do across the state of Texas. But what I do find interesting is that they are willing to spend $63 million on a football stadium for a school district, but they're not going to do something to protect our children. That blows my mind.
Yeah, and we need to take a beat. So we still don't know what the timeline or what the decision-making, what the impetus was for the decision-making on the ground in Uvalde that day. We do know that there were missteps, obviously.
Right.
How many and for what purpose, who knows? But until we get all of those answers, are we really going to make this knee-jerk reaction because it happened on our soil, as opposed to what happens every weekend in Chicago or what happens all the time in Baltimore, all these other cities that have pretty tight gun laws, but they deal with
interesting though.
gun
we can
violence.
have as much tight gun laws as possible. But we have our border patrol that are finding underground tunnels where they're trafficking guns into the state of Texas, into the United States, into California. So we have guns coming through into our state every single day.
Flooding the market.
And that's because, one, we do have a porous border. We can touch on that, which we've had politicians for 30 years say, I am going to secure our southern border. And it seems like that's just like a political one-liner, and we're going to secure the border. And then they get a little bit done, and they haven't gotten anything done. But it all goes hand in hand. I mean, if you're going to start talking about guns and you want to keep them out of the hands of the citizens and you want to restrict them, but you don't want to close the border down, knowing that they're being trafficked in.
Yeah. I'm still trying to figure out how we legislate people's hearts and minds. It's not going to ever happen. We already have all the laws in place that should have and could have, and on the daily does prevent a mass shooting from happening. It just takes one person who is determined and who has the mindset where these kids are completely dehumanized, and he's going to break every single law to make it happen.
You said something that I want you to kind of elaborate, because I've never had you elaborate on this, but you said that the trafficking is like homegrown.
Right. A majority of the victims of sex trafficking, human trafficking in Texas are born and raised in those towns. So I visited a home in the McKinney area, part of Dallas, Fort Worth area. And she said 90% of the survivors that they deal with were born and raised in that area. There's a hopelessness, or there's a trauma in their past, which makes them vulnerable to being victimized and turned into a commodity by a trafficker. And then in Dallas, of course, and in Houston, there's major sports teams, which draws in the demand. So as long as the demand is there, the supply is going to be there. So it's all circular. You've got the open border, which obviously brings in victims of trafficking as well. You've got the sexualization of children, the victimization of children, the dehumanization of children. And it all kind of comes together for this perfect storm and creates a human trafficking
we have a lot to talk about, but legislature.
Yes.
Yes. And there's something that's profound. Legislature, they don't want to talk about it.
Right.
Well, I don't understand why politicians don't want to talk about it. It's almost kind of like they want to run on the topic, because if they run on the topic, they're going to do something, but they don't want to talk about it.
And it's sort of the same barriers that we've come up against here in Texas when it comes to enforcing election laws. Recently, our state Supreme Court determined that the Attorney General cannot enforce election law. That is, I don't know how they came to that decision. It doesn't make any sense to me that they can't be the final arbiter of enforcing criminal penalties, but you're leaving it then to local DAs. And of course, in Austin, San Antonio, and other areas, you have really woke DAs that just...
Well, we have George Soros that's coming into our state that is putting a lot of money into these races, and they're putting, like you said, some very woke district attorneys, but I mean, the backlash is coming with it.
This past year, or the past couple of years since COVID, you've had this upswell of mama bears just pissed off at what's happening to their kids. And if you ever want to see a huge movement come about, you start poking those mama bears and you go after their kids, and you're going to get a swift and strong response. And I think we're seeing that all up and down the ticket in Texas. You've got groups like Moms for Liberty, Mama Bears Rising. We're coming up, and we're making sure that our voices are known.
And it's really, I'm seeing the moms starting to rise. Now, I have to say, my daughter is in high school, so I can't imagine some of these mothers that have children that are in elementary school sized children. Like, I have a nephew, and he's starting elementary school this year. I can't imagine what he's in for. I was just talking about that recently with my family. Like, I can't imagine that. But when you go after a mom's child, you're going to see a lion come out in them. Like, I mean, the claws are literally going to come out.
Yeah.
But education, and that is where I'm starting to notice, I don't know if I want to say grooming. We're seeing education go from reading, writing, arithmetics, knowing you're going from your teacher's last name to now you know her sex or his or her sexuality, if they're married, their first name, if they have children, and
what they did on the weekend.
It's like, what they're doing on the weekend, that the kids should have a right to know everything that's personal about them. But education this is where it really shocked me, and this is where I was just blown away when I found out that they're really sexualizing education, especially in the state of Texas. I know when we went to school, we had health class, 5th grade?
Right.
That's when we learned.
Separated boys and girls.
You're right. We had the boys class and the girls class, but we had health classes. Now, they have a high school class. It's a course, and of course, it's like one of those other things that they like to change the name of it. But they have different courses, and they're not labeling it as sex education.
Right.
But they're talking to girls about abortion, and they're talking to them about HIV. So they're making them aware of HIV, but when they talk about it, they're telling them to use sterile needles.
Right.
This is Texas.
Or if you want to cut yourself, use a sterile razor blade. So it doesn't just end with it's not even sex ed. I wouldn't call it sex ed, because when I say sex ed, I think reproduction, biology.
Well, that is in this course, though.
Right.
It's reproduction, but they're calling it the reproduction and women's health care, but they're talking to them about abortion.
Right.
And this is a solid year.
And they're framing it as a reproductive right.
They're framing it as that. And then they're talking about STDs. But what's interesting is when they're talking about STDs, they're telling the children, and this is where I think moms have to get involved with what's going on in their high schools. It's easy when you have a high schooler. They're independent. They get their work done. Then they go to work, or they go to cheer, or they go to a practice. But they're talking to them about STDs. But they want them to talk about an adult, talk to an adult, but not talk to their parent,
right,
about that situation.
There's this twisting, and I was actually on a Zoom call for educators today, kind of spying on Educators in Solidarity, which is kind of a woke teacher group. And one of the teachers was talking about how you foster an intimate relationship with your students to the point where you become like family to them. And that, to me, is completely inappropriate. I mean, you need to set boundaries with your students. You don't want to get so comfortable, or want your student to get that comfortable with you that they start to treat you as family. That's not your role. But we're encouraging that. We're encouraging these teachers to become a surrogate for their parents, or for these counselors to become a surrogate for the kids' parents.
Well, I think they're wanting to remove the parent from the equation, because it's
absolutely.
almost like the government wants to raise our children.
Right.
There's a big misconception that everyone from California is liberal. They're moving to the state of Texas, and that's why Texas is turning blue. And I thought that.
Right.
When I came here, I thought that. And Luke Macias was like, nope. I was like, really? He was like, no. So I really thought, oh my gosh, all these liberals want a low tax state. They're all coming here. And he's like, no. He was like, they are starting in education, and then they're working their way up. And once they get into the college age, now you got new voters.
Right.
And they are, that's where they're flipping these teenagers right out of high school, which, golly, now it's starting in junior high.
And then who do those college students then go on to teach? You know, if these college students are in there for, well, whether it's nursing or, you know, teaching, they're going on to influence the next generation with whatever they learn on these.
We're breeding liberals.
Right, right.
We're raising liberals. We're breeding liberals, and that was something that I dealt with for a season back in California with my kids. I have my daughter's is liberal, more liberal. My son being back in Texas, you know, he's 20, so he knows, he's seen the difference between the gas prices in California and the gas prices in Texas, and taxes and stuff like that. But they did raise a little activist when I was in California, especially during the Black Lives Matter movement. And I did see how the media, what they saw on their television, was completely opposite, but the school was breeding these children as activists, because even though she had some really valid points, she did not have the whole story. It was just what they were teaching her at school. And it was completely one-sided, one way. And so in Texas, I think we're breeding liberals.
Yep.
And then they're showing up to vote at the polls. And that's why our state, I believe, and that's what he told me from like the data that they have, that's why Texas is starting to flip a little bit more blue, because we're breeding them in our college educational systems, because they've gone full woke.
Yes. And higher education has long been sort of an epicenter of Marxist ideology. It's just gotten more and more out in the open and more acceptable. So it kind of creeped in through gender studies. I took gender studies when I was in college at UT Austin. But it was focused on the masculine, feminine, you know, spectrum, with the understanding that biology determines what your sex is, and that's it.
That's when you trust the science.
Right.
Now it's like...
Now it's you're assigned at birth.
Yeah, it's like, don't trust the science. Trust what the liberal says the science is, or the Constitution is what the Democrats say it is. That's like always like my one-liner. There is a lot of stuff that's happening right here in your backyard. You have superintendents that are corrupt. You have a school board that is corrupt. You have parents that are fighting. I have to say they're fighting for their children. I don't like to say they're standing up, because we're at a stage in Texas where they are fighting for their kids. And there is pornography in schools. There's paperwork that's being sent home to teachers telling them not to tell their parents. You have I say there's a civil war going on in Texas in some areas, and you're in the midst of a civil war.
And it's one of those situations where a lot of us moved into areas like Round Rock or Leander, where we're at right now, where we thought, you know, Austin will stay Austin.
Right.
It's never going to happen out here.
Right.
But eventually those people that live in Austin get a little bit older, they can't afford to live there anymore, or they start to, have families, and then they move out into the suburbs like we all did. So it's creeping in here, and it's becoming less and less tolerable. But what is amazing is that the parents are now so engaged and so motivated and much more politically savvy than they have been in the past. In 2015, when I was spending time at the Capitol, there weren't a whole lot of other parents that were interested or knew how legislation was passed or even knew who their school board trustees were. Now you'd be hard-pressed to find a Round Rock parent that doesn't know who the school board trustees are and doesn't know what's happening at every single meeting. Like, there's this whole joke about make school boards boring, or school board meetings boring again, because nobody used to go.
I mean, it's over the last year, just watching all these different things evolve.
Yeah.
It's gone from making people aware, people don't know. I think once they started arresting parents on school property, that really started making national attention. And I think that needed to happen because that's something that has to happen in Texas, because there are so many people here that I even talk to, even up where I live in Frisco. They are not aware of what is going on.
Right.
Parents, if you are not on television, if you are not on social media, if you are not engaged locally with what's going on, you're not aware of what's happening. I can take a week off of being on my phone and I'm not even aware of what's happening all over the country, let alone in the state of Texas.
And there's a playbook. I mean, it's pretty clear, because up by where you live in McKinney, the school board there is essentially repeating what our Round Rock ISD school board has tried with censuring the conservative trustees, and they've got the bloated central admin. So you've got this highly paid superintendent who doesn't listen to community feedback, and then the board kind of insulates him or her. I mean, it's happening in districts all over the place. But we're seeing the same thing, and part of it is that we, all of our school boards get the same training from Texas Association of School Boards, and they're as woke as can be.
Do you think, I've always wondered this, do you think that the unions, are infiltrating our school system? I know at first the running joke outside of Texas was, we're going to go in and we are going to flip your city councils. Okay, and now it seems like they're going to go in and they are going to change the school boards because we were so focused on the city council that they got in with our children. Do you think that the unions are coming in and they're activists and they're posing as teachers, and that's how they're getting in right underneath our nose?
So we're not a union state in Texas, right? But you do still have these affiliations,
right,
that have a huge influence on our curriculum. They have a huge influence on anti-bullying supplemental programs. They're tied in with organizations like Planned Parenthood or GLSCN to bring gay or LGBTQ curriculum or programs into schools. And you have things like Gay Straight Alliance that have come from that, and how to go about accommodating for transgender students, where this wasn't even a discussion. It wasn't a topic until NEA teamed up with GLSCN, and then they started bringing these things into the schools and saying that this is important. We have to focus on this. We have to make sure that these kids feel comfortable. We can't discriminate against them. And then, of course, Biden is enforcing that with Title IX and saying now that he's threatening to remove funding for school cafeterias if the schools are not complying with Title IX.
I'm glad that you were able to join us today. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There is so much more that I want to explore. If you're a mom, if you're a father, you're a parent, your grandfather, I don't care if you have children in your home, you need to be aware of what's going on in these children's schools, what's happening in your backyard. Because I've heard so many parents say, I had no idea this was taking place right underneath my nose. And then once they started digging, then they started finding other parents that were like-minded with them. So Texas is not going to just change by chance. Texas is going to change by choice. And we need you to get involved locally on a community level. That doesn't mean you have to jump all in head first, but we have a chance to change the state of Texas, and it's our choice to do it. So thank you for joining us today, and I'll see you down the road.
You made it to the end of this video. You're probably 1 in a million. But since you're here, make sure you go to texasscorecard.com to find more journalism and commentary, all things pertaining to Texas. Make sure you also like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and hit the bell. That way you can be notified when new videos come out. Thanks.